They called it the Vanishing, a series of market moves so subtle, so well orchestrated, that for years it looked less like crime and more like a market miracle. Money appeared where there had been none, fortunes inflated and then quietly harvested, and the instruments of modern finance, data, trust, and reputation, were bent to someone's will. This is the story of one person who, according to our fictional account, turned knowledge into leverage and leverage into a fortune that seemed to evaporate into the air. He was not the sort of villain that headlines like. He was, at least on paper, ordinary, a former quantitative analyst, disciplined, precise, someone who preferred equations to ego. In conversations that later surfaced, colleagues described him as quietly brilliant, the kind of person who could see patterns in noise and who loved puzzles more than people. If complacency is the enemy of detection, curiosity can be the tool that builds it. He spent years studying how markets listen, which signals they respond to, how quickly they react, and where regulation leaves gaps. The scheme he built, and make no mistake, the word scheme fits here, not as a how-to, but as a structure of intent, rested on an understanding more psychological than technical. Markets do not move only on fundamentals, they move on expectations. A rumor, a flurry of activity, a repeated small action can trigger models and algorithms to infer something larger is happening. He learned to speak the market's language and to do so without ever using plain words. At the highest level, his operation balanced three pillars. First, concealment. Layers of legal entities, nominee accounts, and legitimate intermediaries that made tracing funds slow and noisy. These were not brazen shell companies with flashing warnings. They were plausible businesses with addresses, phone numbers, and paperwork that could pass a cursory review. Second, signal shaping, creating a credible appearance of demand, interest, or liquidity where little existed, enough to tilt algorithmic interpretations and human perception. Third, monetization, taking positions that quietly benefited from the distorted prices and then extracting gains in ways that looked routine, dividends, transfers, private sales, until the accumulated sums reached into the millions and beyond. It is important to stress one thing up front: the details of how this was accomplished are intentionally high level here. The drama of this story lies in the psychology, the mistakes, and the investigative chase, not in any procedural instructions. Our purpose is to tell a tense, mysterious tale of greed and detection, not to teach criminal methods. For months, the market shrugged. Tiny anomalies were logged by compliance systems and archived in quiet folders. Machines flagged outliers and moved on, but patterns, when repeated, become loud. Investigators began to notice clusters of accounts that behaved in synchronized ways, activity that was too coordinated to be random, too patient to be mere coincidence. Assets that had been inert for years would wake in unison, with interest and allocation that seemed to mirror each other across multiple platforms. When human compliance officers stepped into the data, they felt the same thing: a hair on the back of the neck. This was not natural. Usually it is human error that betrays sophisticated deception. In this case, it was the same. A single payment instruction, misfiled by one of the many intermediaries, contained a breadcrumb, an email header, an originating IP address, a timestamp that did not match the story told by the accounts. That sliver of truth, combined with slow, painstaking subpoena work, began to stitch the fog into a pattern. Once the investigators had a toehold, a node that tied entities together, they widened the net. They traced addresses, followed correspondent relationships, and looked for the human fingerprints that no amount of shelling can fully erase. The psychology behind the scheme was elegant. He did not need to flood the market with capital to move prices. He only needed to create credible movement in places where models and traders already paid attention. Markets are haunted by confirmation bias. If a signal fits a pre-existing belief, it will be amplified. By repeatedly producing small, believable signals across diverse channels, he created a chorus that the market mistook for a soloist. Algorithms, bots, and human traders each added their own volume, and price shifts followed. This created two strategic advantages. One, plausibility. When price moves follow an understandable narrative, they attract real participants who, without knowing the origin, reinforce the direction. 2. Camouflage. Small, consistent profits can be folded back into legitimate operations, laundered through normal-looking transfers and accounted for. as employee bonuses, vendor payments, or investment returns. Over time, the sum of many modest-looking extractions grew into a mountain. But the mountain casts a shadow. As funds accumulated, so did risk. He diversified where it mattered, geographically through different instrument types and across custodians, so that the collapse of any single strand would not expose the whole. He also relied on trust, well-placed reputations, former colleagues, and compliant intermediaries who, at worst, served as plausible deniability. That social architecture is often as powerful as any legal firewall. People believe what they want to believe. A respected intermediary can inoculate reckless behavior against skepticism. Investigators, meanwhile, learn to read the social architecture too. Beyond numbers, they looked for motive and opportunity. Why would a former analyst risk everything? The answer matters less in logic than in human stories. Pride, resentment, a confidence in one's intellectual superiority, or the corrosive whisper of entitlement. Motive became a lens through which they viewed anomalies. Opportunity mapped the pathways where networks intersected. Once the investigation shifted from merely tracking money to understanding relationships, it accelerated. In the courtroom, the narrative mattered. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a person who used expertise to create illusions, and who then relied on the opacity of modern financial plumbing to extract value. Defense counsel countered with complexity, that markets are messy, that correlation is not causation, and that complex operations can produce unexpected results without malice. The trial turned into a contest between narratives as much as facts. Evidence was debated not only for what it proved, but for what it implied about intent. Human error kept returning as the decisive element. A compliance analyst, cross-referencing counterparty data, noticed a pattern of payments that recurred on the same day each month, a cadence that should have, but did not, align with any legitimate business cycle for the entities involved. An intern in a registrar office failed to redact a metadata tag on a public filing. A contractor left a laptop unlocked in a cafe. Each small lapse built a bridge for investigators to cross. When the net finally closed, it did so not with the cinematic drama of a midnight raid, but with a sequence of quiet seizures, freezes, and civil suits, instruments designed to reclaim ill-gotten gains and to warn others. Bank accounts were frozen, corporate structures dismantled, and reputations burned with the slow, public chemistry of litigation. Assets were recovered in part, but not entirely. As in many financial crimes, some of the value had already been rerouted to legitimate purchases, to people who thought they were receiving ordinary payments, a painting here, a property there, the sorts of things that are hard to unwind. The aftermath left more questions than certainties. Regulators tightened controls and forced new transparency measures. Trading platforms improve monitoring for coordinated behavior, but markets are adaptive. New modes of concealment appear where old ones are closed off, and human ingenuity finds the next set of loopholes to exploit. That is not a moral failing unique to one actor. It is the perpetual motion of systems that reward advantage. There is a human cost, too. Investors who lost money saw portfolios evaporate. Employees of implicated firms faced job uncertainty. Careers were ruined even where legal guilt was never proven. The broader lesson is less about punishment and more about vigilance. Financial systems depend on layers of trust, between counterparties, between firms and regulators, and between citizens and institutions. When that trust is corroded, the cost is social as much as economic. What does this fictional saga teach us? First, expertise can be weaponized when divorced from ethics. The same analytic skills that design safer, more efficient markets can, in the wrong hands, create illusions that move capital. Second, systems are only as strong as their weakest human link. Technology scales patterns, but humans still leave the breadcrumbs that close cases. Finally, transparency is not a panacea, but it is essential. When data flows freely and accountability is clear, deception becomes harder and discovery becomes faster. In the end, The Vanishing was as much a story of hubris as of technique. A person who believed they could outthink institutions learned, instead, that institutions, messy and slow though they may be, were built with redundancies for a reason. He had gambled on opacity and won for a time, but the very complexity he exploited also contained the means of his undoing. Interfaces, logs, and people who, in the end, asked the right questions at the right time. This tale offers no neat moral closure. Some of the money was recovered. Some of the players paid in reputation more than currency. Regulators issued reforms, markets adjusted, and life in its ordinary, unglamorous way continued. But the story remains a cautionary fable about knowledge without restraint, about the seductive power of pattern seeing, and about the slow, certain work of investigation. If there is a final note, it is this: systems are created by people and for people. When we build systems that assume the best intentions, we make our world better, until the rare person chooses otherwise. The remedy is not only more rules, but better culture, rewarding transparency, training curiosity toward ethics, and keeping human judgment alive alongside automation. Those are the things that, in the end, make vanishing acts harder to pull off. If you found this story compelling, subscribe for more explorations of mysteries at the edges of finance, technology, and human behavior. Leave a comment. What part of the vanishing did you find most surprising? The method, the motive, or the mistake that exposed everything? We'll read them and bring you more deep dives into the shadowy corners where knowledge and temptation collide. Thank you for listening.